Okay, so let's continue to cover DRAM in main memory system. So I think I stopped around here. So I think this is kind of summary what we did like last time, what we covered. So we went over the internals of DRAM, and there are multiple banks that can operate in parallel. So we need to exploit the parallelism, what is called bank level parallelism, to achieve good performance in using DRAM. And also we need to do some like memory access scheduling, because the column access is actually much cheaper than the row like activation, right? So we need to actually maximize the locality of access, such that once you open a row, then you try to maximally serve all the like column requests towards that row. So that's the idea. So we need to also exploit the locality like cache. So also we went over some like software optimization for DRAM. By changing the data layout, we can actually maximize the for locality. So we make basically the idea is by doing some like a tiling, we can the memory request stream as sequential as possible, right? So now by changing the memory access mapping, now this like block access now becomes sequential access to the same row. So in that way, we can maximize the locality of DRAM access. So that's basically what we covered last time. So today we're gonna move on to refresh. So refresh is kind of downside of DRAM. So how we can deal with it. So it's kind of inconvenient truth in using DRAM. So what's the refresh and why we care? So here we're gonna start from there. So what is refresh? So I think if you remember, we in DRAM we store like 1 bit of information using a capacitor. So the DRAM cell looks like this. So this one's got access transistor. We actually have like a word line. So this one is either connected, disconnected, depending on the value of word line, right? It's a word line, and there's like a 1 bit capacitor. This one actually stores like 1 bit of information. And the capacitor is nothing but a micro battery, right? So it's like a battery, so this one. So we store like 1 bit information there. And you can think of it as like a micro battery. So if you have a battery, if it's fully charged, then value is 1. And if it's discharged, then the value is 0. It is how we actually signal, like encode like 1 bit of information. And as you know, even if you fully charge this like a battery, if you leave it idle a long time, then it eventually loses all the charge, right? So that's what happens. That's the truth for all batteries we have, right? The same thing actually happens to this DRAM. So even if you actually let's say use value like 1 by putting some charge, so after some time elapsed, then eventually you lose all the charge. So in other words, you lose the value, right? So that's the reason why. But in this case, this micro battery is really, really tiny. So it doesn't really take a long time to lose all this charge. So that's a problem. So typically, even if you actually fully charge this capacitor, it only takes maybe somewhere around like 64 milliseconds to lose all the charge. Okay. So that's a problem. So we need to periodically refresh the value. So refreshing the value means that just reinforce the value. If you because you keep losing the charge, you make like a fresh one again during this at regular interval. That's called refresh. Like you're refreshing the value. So in any like a DRAM system must deal with this problem of refresh. So doing refresh means every 64 milliseconds you need to basically refresh the charge of all the cells in your DRAM. Okay, that is a problem. So that's called the refresh issue. And we're going to deal with, we're going to cover how we can solve the problem. So here is what happens when you do refresh. So as I said, you periodically lose the value in the cell, like in the capacitor. So to refresh the value, what you do is very simple. You simply activate the row and close the row. That's it. That's refresh, right? Because once you actually activate the row, then basically what happens is there's a sense amplifier that actually develop the charge to 1 and 0. So now you recover the value in the cell as well as the bit line. right? Eventually, the value becomes 1 or 0, depending on the value of the cell, right? So now you recover the original value, and then you pre-charge again. You basically close the row. Then the cell, now you actually have the, the strong 1 or strong 0 again, right? So refresh is nothing but simply just activate and pre-charge. So here, let's say you want to actually refresh this cell. Then what you do is you first apply the activate command. Then after like a TRAS was, the time it takes from, 0.5 VDD to VDD. I mean, because now, because of the charge sharing, now the value continues to develop, and eventually, it becomes 1 or 0, depending on the value of a cell, right? So the TRAS was the time it takes to, the value becomes complete 1 or complete 0. So that's TRAS, right? So once you actually the time TRAS elapsed, then now you actually close, like pre-charge it. And you pre-charge again, then this cell is refreshed. And you need to repeat this process for all the rows in your DRAM, right? So that's the problem. So basically, that's what unit refresh operation, and you need to repeat this process for all the rows in your chip. So during the active period, controller issues auto refresh command every 7.8 microsecond. Why is it so? Because as I said, you need to refresh all the rows every 64 milliseconds, right? So and then let's say there are like 8,000. You can actually issue 8,192 refresh command every 64 milliseconds. Then you can actually calculate the interval, right? Because if you can actually issue this number of refreshes during this interval, then you can actually calculate the interval between the two adjacent refreshes, right? So eventually you have like a 64, 60. Oh dear. You have 64 millisecond of refresh window. 64 milliseconds. This is called like a refresh window, which is TREFW. So let's say you have like a 64 millisecond refresh window. Then you have a certain number of rows to refresh. Then you actually have to divide. That actually gives you the number, right? So and then if you assume like you can issue 8,000 like 8K refreshes per 64 millisecond, then this is refresh 1, this is refresh 2, refresh 3. This is time axis, by the way. This time, refresh 1, refresh 2, refresh 3. And then you can actually calculate this like interval between two adjacent refresh commands, right? So if you divide like this number by 8,192, that gives you 7.8 microsecond, which is called like a REFI, refresh interval. Okay? So once you actually receive the DRAM chip receives the auto refresh command, then DRAM performs refreshes for somewhere between like 1 to like 8 rows, depending on the capacity. Okay? And there's another like timing parameter called TRFC, which is how long it takes to refresh a single like either some number of rows, somewhere between like 1 and 8. So once you basically that's the cycle time, the amount of time it takes to perform the refresh as a response to the refresh command, right? So it look like this. Let me just erase them to show it better. So now this is gone. Now come back. So here it looks like this. Once you issue like auto refresh command, then actually DRAM receives it, and it selects the next row to refresh, and then it activates the row. So it takes like a TRAS time to fully develop the charge in the bit line, and then it's followed by the pre-charge, right? And then the next one, this is like a RC. This is like what is called cycle time, TRC. This is called cycle time, by the way. And then it takes if you do like a multiple refresh, like a multiple rows for like a single like a refresh command, then you may do actually like a multiple refreshes for a single like a refresh command. So in this case, let's say we do like a 4 rows together, then it takes like this amount of time, right? And this time, entire time is called T RFC. This is a refresh cycle time. So this is T RFC. So this is basically, overhead time, it takes to like refresh, like in this case, four rows, back to back. Okay. And after 7.8 microsecond, there will be another refresh command. And as a response, now you do it again, like you do like refresh like 4 rows again, like a TROS followed by TRP, and do it like 4 times, and then this one takes like another T RFC. Okay. So what is the problem with like this refresh? What is the problem here? 리프레시 하면은 문제가 뭐예요, 단점이? What's the problem here? 싱크로나이제이션 문제? 어떤 싱크로나이제이션 문제? 예를 들어서. 네. 수정하려고 하는데 리프레시를 하고 있으면 네, 뭐 싱크로나이제이션 문제라고 볼 수 있는데 사실은 더 쉽게 설명하는 방법은 리프레시를 하는 동안에는 그 뱅크가 블락되겠죠. 그러니까 내가 어떤 로우를 리프레시하고 있으면은 그 뱅크에 예를 들면 다른 로우를 액세스하는 그런 걸 처리할 수가 없잖아요. 그죠? 물론 같은 로우에 대한 것도 처리할 수 없을 거고. 그죠? 그러니까 쉽게 말하면 그냥 이 시간 동안은 뱅크가 블락되는 거죠. 그 지금 리프레시가 되고 있는 뱅크가 블락이 되는 거죠. 그래서 그 지금 뱅크로 가야 되는 리퀘스트가 처리가 못 되고 지금 대기하고 있겠죠. 그죠? So this actually blocks the bank. This actually refresh operation blocks the bank being refreshed. Okay? Of course, there's some performance overhead because of that, right? And another, the second like overhead is kind of the energy overhead, because it's kind of regardless of you are doing something useful or not, this refresh must be done in background, right? So it continuously, it consumes some like a power and energy. So that's kind of another like overhead of like energy and power. So this is like another problem. So here, refresh problem, performance and energy overhead associated with this refresh. And then generally speaking, as the memory capacity increases, the overhead becomes larger. Okay, so that's a general problem. And also, second problem is it actually makes this case memory access latency longer. Maybe that's like what you mean by like synchronization problem. Maybe like it's kind of connected, because let's say you try to access some like specific bank, then it just started like a refresh. Then what happens is this request must wait until this like refresh is completed, right? So it's kind of very unlucky like a request, because it has to wait for a long time before it's finally become serviced, right? So that's basically why it actually makes this worst case memory access latency longer, which may be problematic, especially in like real-time system. Maybe self-driving car. Maybe self-driving car tries to make a decision within certain like a millisecond or microsecond like range. Then this DRAM is blocked, then it's trouble, right? So there's problems and solutions, and there's a bunch of solutions I'm going to go over like in the next few slides. So stay tuned. So let's think about some like a case study. What happens here? So we are here. So here we assume like we have like a 2 gigabit DDR. It's a long time. It's like 8 years ago. DDR2. Wow, it's kind of old material. Sorry. DDR2 with 8 banks. So let's do some like calculation here. So let's say we have like a 2 gigabit DRAM chip, and we have like 8 banks, and this is total number of rows to refresh, because we have like 32K rows to refresh at every like a 64 millisecond, right? So so within like a 64 millisecond window, we have to go through all like individual rows to refresh, right? That's the problem we are solving. So here, the assumption is we can issue at most 8,192 refresh commands per like a 64 like the refresh window. Then, and every like refresh command, we actually spend this amount of time. This one's RFC. Refresh cycle time, right? Once you actually get a refresh, it takes certain like a number of like nanosecond to actually do the refresh. So in this case, the TRFC is like a 197. So this, let's say this is parameter, DRAM's parameter. Then that means that every like a 64 millisecond, this amount of time will be blocked due to refresh, right? So if you have like a 64 like millisecond window, we actually consume this amount of time for refresh, right? And then during the refresh, this DRAM chip is blocked, or specific bank is blocked, right? So if you calculate it, then the performance overhead is like about like a 2.5, of total time. So among like if you have like 100 seconds of time, 2.5 seconds is actually blocked for this refresh, right? That's performance overhead. And also we can also calculate how many rows we need to refresh at every single like refresh command, because we issue 8,000 something refresh commands, and we have like a 32K rows to refresh. So if it's simple math, when you divide it, then at every single refresh you need to refresh like a 4 rows, right? That's basically the simple like math, right? So by the way, this one is called like an auto refresh. So auto refresh because you just send like a refresh command, then the DRAM itself, it automatically determines which row to refresh next. So you don't really have to pinpoint. You is a controller, like memory controller. Memory controller doesn't have to specify which row to refresh next. It simply just send the command like an auto refresh, and then the DRAM itself actually calculate which row to refresh next. So that's the reason why it's like called auto refresh command. What happens if you actually have like a twice as much like size, like it's twice bigger size than the original one? So we have like a 4 gigabit like a DDR2. Then now we have the same number of banks, but we have 2x more rows, right? That means the capacity of like each bank becomes like twice as large as before. And then of course now, because now we actually have to refresh like 8 rows instead of 4 for every like a single like a refresh command. So that actually increased this like a RFC like refresh cycle time by a factor of 2. So now we actually have to spend like twice as much time for like a single like refresh. So if you do the math again, now we actually plug in this like a 32.5 nanosecond instead of like a 197. Then you compute the value. Now the overhead now becomes 4.2% in performance. So what happens if you have a bigger DRAM, bigger DRAM? Then it continuously increases the amount time that actually that blocks the DRAM will actually increase as much, right? So that's certainly problematic. And also modern like DRAM, they support like a postponing or pulling like refresh commands. I mean, of course, the only requirement we have to satisfy is that every like refresh during every refresh window, we actually have to go through all like a 64, refresh all the rows in the chip. That's the only requirement. So this like a refresh doesn't have to be at the same interval, right? The only like constraint is every row is touched every 64 milliseconds. That's the only requirement. They don't have to be uniformly distributed in time. So sometimes maybe you can do something like this. Maybe you actually skip some number of like refresh interval, and then you do it like in burst. Okay? Or this is like a postponing, because now you skip like this certain number of intervals, and then now you actually compensate for it by doing this refresh in burst, right? Or likewise, maybe you can actually pull it because you do this refresh in advance before you actually do some before your time slot arrives. So it's like a postponing and pulling refresh commands are also okay to do, because maybe sometimes you may want to like exploit some idle period. Maybe there are some time your system is basically doing nothing, like idle. Then maybe you do some like more like refresh during that like time window. Or if you are really busy, I mean your CPU generates a lot of like memory requests, then you may just skip it. You just postpone this like a refresh to service this like a CPU request first. Okay? 네, 네. 근데 다른 로우를 네. 왜요? 짧은 로우를 여러 번 하는 게 이제 그러니까 같은 로우를 하면 의미가 없죠. 근데 이제 여러 개 다른 로우를 이렇게 다르게 하니까 그냥 기본적으로 무슨 얘기냐면은 64ms 안에 무조건 내가 마지막으로 이 로우를 예를 들면 어떤 타임에 얘를 리프레시를 했다 그러면은 64ms가 지나기 전에만 얘를 한 번만 리프레시 해주면 되는 거거든요. 그러니까 이제 그렇게 예, 하여튼 전체적으로 한 번만 이제 64ms 윈도우 안에서 한 번씩만 터치해주면 되는 거니까 그게 이제 조금 벌스티하게 올 수도 있고 아니면 이게 유니폼하게 올 수도 있고 그건 중요한 건 아니죠. And this problem is actually becoming worse because as you actually make like a transistor scaling, now this transistor is becoming smaller and smaller. Then this transistor, this cell, this like a capacitor, now becomes really, really. So that means you actually have like a lower capacitance. So it actually takes shorter time to discharge this like your like electrons. Okay. So this refresh problem is really serious because actually entire like, this DRAM industry is kind of in serious trouble. In dealing with this issue because they try to cut the cost. They really want to make this like a cell smaller and smaller. But now it takes just split of a second to lose this charge. So that means that now you have to actually refresh more frequently than before, right? So this like refresh interval is getting shorter and shorter. So this is a serious problem. Okay, the second problem is like worst case memory access latency. It's kind of obvious because now during the interval you are doing like a refresh, this DRAM like a bank is blocked, right? So all the requests that actually headed toward that bank must be held back until this like refresh is completed. So that's a problem here. You can see, let's say every 64 millisecond, 8,000 something auto refresh commands are issued by memory controller to DRAM. And the issue interval is like a 7.8 microsecond if you actually do it like uniformly. This is called REFI, like refresh interval. So during this, like once you actually this refresh command is given, during refresh cycle time, DRAM cannot be accessed because it's blocked for like refresh. So the worst case latency occurs when the read request arrives just after the refresh has started. Okay. So it's maybe the worst case latency can take some like this number like a 300 something nanosecond plus the access time for your request, something like additional like 100 nanosecond or some tens to hundreds of nanosecond, right? So it can take a long time to fulfill your request. As I said, this may be a serious problem especially for like real-time system. Serious trouble for 이창건 교수님 because he is doing real-time system, not me. So yeah. Anyway, so this one kind of is a serious problem, especially the autopilots or some like physical systems. They actually need to control this physical entity. So that yeah, TRFC. You have to wait until this period. So how we can solve the problem? So original specification. Each in this like a specific example, let's say we assume like a 4 gigabit DRAM chip. Then each like auto refresh command refresh 8 rows because we did the math, right? So 8 rows means that because we have like 8 banks, you can think of it as like at every refresh command we refresh 1 row per bank. So basically we refresh like 8 banks in parallel, right? So sometimes this latency could be too long for real-time CPU program. So the solution is like a fine-grained refresh. So LPDDR is like a low power. It's like a low power mobile DRAM. So LPDDR is a low power DRAM standard, which is pretty different from the desktop like a DDR4. So it should support what is called fine-grained refresh. So the idea is really simple. You simply, the idea is now you reduce this interval by factor of 2. Instead of like doing this refresh every like 7.8 microsecond, you actually shorten the interval by factor of 2. Then you can actually refresh like half of the rows at any given time, right? Because now you actually do this like originally, let's say we did the refresh at the interval of 7.8 like microsecond, but now we actually do it like twice as frequently as before, 2x like faster. Then because now you do like more frequently, you only need to refresh only 4 rows instead of 8 to cover all the rows within the 64 millisecond. So it's nothing magic. I mean, simply just you do it less, but more frequently, twice as frequently, but do like 2x less per like refresh. So in this way, there's trade-off. So now you actually decrease this like a refresh interval, meaning that you actually do it more frequently, but accordingly you actually reduce this TRFC, because now you need to do only like half of the job, right? So that's basically a trade-off. So you can actually do like either like a 2x or 4x. You can even do like a 4x. Then you actually cut this refresh interval by a factor of 4, and then as a response, in return, you actually only need to do like 2 rows per refresh. Yeah. 그거는 이제 내부 이제 팔러시에 따라서 많이 바뀌는데 많이 디펜던트한데요. 뭐 짝수, 홀수 뭐 그렇게 하진 않고 보통 그냥 시퀀셜하게 보통 하는 게 일반적이에요. 시퀀셜하게 그냥 이렇게 예를 들면은 뭐 그냥 순차적으로 그냥 이렇게 하는 게, 왜냐면 그게 하기가 쉽잖아요. 왜냐면 메모리가 제일 적게 필요하잖아요. 만약에 이렇게 막 건너뛰고 막 이렇게 하면은 예를 들면 어디까지 했는지를 더 예를 들면 복잡하게 이걸 트래킹을 해야 되니까 그냥 일단 기본적으로 하는 거는 그냥 순차적으로 로 0번, 로 1번 이런 식으로 일단 기본이고요. 거기에서 이제 조금 더 이제 뒤에도 얘기하겠지만 조금 더 이제 소피스티케이티드 되게 하면은 이제 뭔가 죽은 데이터를 갖고 있는 뭐 로우는 스킵을 한다든지, 아니면 무슨 뭐 아예 그냥 뱅크 레벨에서 죽어 있는 데이터가 있는 뱅크는 아예 그냥 뱅크 전체를 그냥 리프레시 안 해버린다든지 뭐 이런 식으로 하는 이제 그런 테크닉들은 좀 들어가요. 어쨌든 베이스라인은 그냥 쭉 순차적으로 그냥 카운트 하나만 있으면 되니까 그러면 그죠? Okay. This way you can actually reduce the worst case memory access latency. Okay. And the second problem is what about the idle time? Idle time is really important too, because if you use like your cell phone, smartphone, for most of the time they are idle. I mean, if you think of track like a 24-hour like usage pattern, only tiny fraction of the time this like phone is active, right? For most of the time it's like this, 그죠? It's like just idle, right? And then we also need to this like idle time. Idle time power is really important to actually maximize battery life, 그죠? 왜냐하면 대부분의 시간이 아이들 타임이기 때문에 어떻게 하면 이 아이들 타임 시간에 이거를 최대한 틀어 잠그느냐에 따라 가지고 이게 배터리 라이프가 되게 길기도 하고 짧아지기도 하겠죠, 그죠? Because we spend most of the time idle, but still during the idle time, this refresh is still happening because we're going to lose the value of memory, right? So the problem is how we can reduce this energy consumption due to like a self-refresh. Self-refresh means even if the CPU is sleeping, self-refresh to actually keep the value of data value in the chip. So that's basically what happens like today's DRAM system. And as I said, this like idle power is takes significant portion of the energy consumption and power. And if you have like larger memory, then actually this the overhead becomes larger accordingly. Okay, that's the problem. So how we can save this idle time power of refresh. One example is a partial array self refresh. It's another like very trivial. I mean, it's a no magic technique. So it's basically the idea is really simple. Let's say you have like 4 banks in your chip. We have like multiple banks in your chip, right? Then if let's say in this case we have 4 banks, and by default we actually refresh all the banks, right? But if you know that certain bank is basically only hold like a dead data, I mean it's invalid data, then you can actually skip it, right? So in this case, let's say you only in this case only half of this array is refreshed, and the other half, this part is not refreshed. So in this way, we can actually save this like refresh power by half, right? And also in this case, in the extreme case, we only keep this like only like 1/4 of the chip area to be active, and the other like a 3/4 of the chip is basically idle. So we actually skip the refresh for these 3 banks. Then there's like a natural question: how do you know? How does DRAM know whether the data I'm holding is like a valid one or invalid one? That's like one question, right? And another question is it like, how do you guarantee that all the data in these like idle banks are really useless? I mean, what just 1 byte of information is a really valuable one? Then how you can basically that nullifies the technique, right? Because you can apply the technique in that case. So it actually has a lot of like issues to implement to make it correct. So let's say the possibility 1, the first possibility of like this is called, by the way, this is called a PASR, partial array self refresh, the PASR, which is used in like LPDDR, like a low power mobile DRAM. Then what's the problem here? So the first possibility is somehow we need to put all these like a live data into 1 bank. Or at least you actually put data into 1 bank, right? Then actually that actually negatively affect the performance. Why? Because now let's say all of your hot like important data is placed on like a single bank, right? Then what is the problem here? Why is bad for performance? 그렇죠. 뱅크 레벨 패러리즘을 죽이기 때문이죠. 원래는 여러 개의 리퀘스트들이 다른 뱅크에 쫙 스프레드 되면서 이게 서로 오버랩이 되면서 그 레이턴시를 전체적으로 줄이는 그런 효과가 있는데, 만약에 모든 지금 중요한 핫한 데이터들이 전부 다 하나의 뱅크에 몰려 있다면 걔네들은 다 시리얼라이즈 될 거예요. 그 뱅크에다 몰릴 거 아니에요. 그죠? 그러면 뱅크 레벨 패러리즘을 이용을 못 하겠죠. 그죠? 다 이렇게 시리얼라이즈가 되니까 리퀘스트들이. Because the first problem is if you actually place all this like hot or important data in a single bank, there's no bank level parallelism because all the requests basically go to the like a specific bank, right? So that's the problem 1. What about the second way? So second way is whenever the system becomes idle, somehow we actually migrate all this like a live data into 1 bank. And then maybe if it wakes up again, maybe we just redistribute this like, data back to original place or something. That's one other thing you could do, right? Then what's the problem here? The second problem is, of course there's an overhead of like migrating this data back and forth, right? Because first you actually gather all this live data into like 1 bank, and the system wakes up, then basically you redistribute this data to the rest of the bank and so on, right? This basically causes like a huge overhead. So there are like 2 problems, possibility 1, possibility 2. So PASR may not be very effective. So maybe alternative solution could be like a fine-grained refresh. This is a PASR. Let's say we actually control this overhead at a very coarse granularity, right? At the bank granularity. But an alternative technique could be we may do like a fine-grained refresh. So in this case, let's say you only refresh like this row, this row, this row, this row. They may be physically distributed in different banks. But here another like a problem could be, what's the problem in this like a fine-grained refresh? 파인그레인 리프레시 하려면 어떻게 뭐가 문제예요? 하나라도 리프레시를 하고 있으면 데이터를 못 쓴다. 데이터가 나눠져 있으면 어디 이 로우에서요? 뱅크에서 그렇죠. 아까 그렇죠. 예를 들면 모든 4개의 뱅크가 다 지금 리프레시 어떤 로우들을 리프레시하고 있으면 걔네들이 다 블락된다는 그런 얘기겠죠. 맞나? 꿈보다 해몽이 더 좋은 것 같은데. 네, 어쨌거나 사실은 you have to actually keep track of all these like live rows somehow. 그죠? It's impossible without like a software support, like operating system support. Because operating system, maintains, manage the memory, does the memory management. So that it tracks, which pages are, valid and which pages are invalid. So it actually has to track, all these like page frames, live page frames and invalid like free like page frames and so on. So this kind of it actually requires this like a software support. So operating system. So in this case, operating system needs to give the address information of power and data to DRAM, which may be May not be impossible, but it's kind of not easy. 그렇죠? And also, interestingly, another interesting like optimization. I don't cover it in this lecture, but another interesting like memory-related optimization is like a compression. Modern like notebook, PC, especially like a MacBook, they actually do like a lot of memory compression. So memory compression means if you see, even if your like physical memory actually use like let's say 4 GB, but you actually internally like compress it to only hold like 1.4 GB and so on. So they actually effectively increase the physical memory size. Of course, the overhead is whenever actually you try to access the data, you first need to decompress it. So there's some like performance overhead. But the software actually predicts those like data which is very highly likely to be accessed in like decrypted like a decompressed form, but those are code data which is unlikely to be accessed in like compressed form. So and software does a pretty good job in doing this prediction. So that's very effective technique. 그러니까 특히 인베디드 시스템이나 이렇게 메모리가 좀 모자라는 그런 시스템에서는 특히 이제 메모리를 잘 쓰는 게 중요하기 때문에 뭐 5만 가지 테크닉을 다 쓰죠. 막 이게 막 백그라운드로 막 컴프레션 했다가 디컴프레션 했다가 뭐 등등등. So. Okay. Questions about refresh? So we're gonna move on to row hammering, like a bug, security bug of DRAM. That's very interesting. But any questions? But you covered so far. 줄어들 수도 있어요. 줄어들 수도 있는데 그렇게 하면은 진짜로 그 메모리가 완전 블럭되겠죠. 되게 긴 시간 동안. 그죠? 그러니까 어떻게 보면은 지금 우리 학생이 얘기하는 거는 거꾸로 가자는 거죠. 여기 그러니까 이거랑 요거랑 거꾸로 가는 거죠. 요건 이제 좀 더 파인 그레인하게 좀 더 이제 자주 적은 양의 로우를 이건 리프레시하다는 쪽이고, 지금 제안하신 거는 이제 이거 쪽이죠. 완전 반대쪽. 리프레시 그냥 인터벌에 한 번만 하는데 그 한 번 하는 동안에 모든 로우를 다 그냥 순차적으로 이렇게 쫙쫙 백투백으로. 그죠? 뭐 그렇게 할 수도 있겠죠. 할 수도 있는데 대신 그렇게 하면 아까 RFC가 엄청 커지겠죠. 그 리프레시 타임이 그냥 한 번 리프레시가 시작되면은 그게 다 모든 전체 DRAM 칩 안에 있는 모든 로우를 다 리프레시한 다음에 풀리니까 이게 아마 최소한 뭐 밀리세컨드 오더도 나오겠죠. 그러니까 굉장히 어떻게 보면 DRAM 시스템에 딱 되니까 그러면은 아마 이게 되게 힘들걸요? 이거 예를 들면은 이게 우리가 핸드폰 쓰는데 뭐 이렇게 터치를 했는데 반응이 안 와. 예를 들면 뭐 그런 것들이 어떻게 쉽게 올 수 있겠죠. 인터럽트 핸들링 같은 거. 왜냐하면 이 지금 리프레시는 64ms만 한 번씩 계속 일어나는 일이기 때문에 굉장히 자주 일어나는 일이거든요. 근데 여기 만약에 그동안에 예를 들면 몇 밀리세컨드씩 블럭된다 그러면 최소한 이거 클릭했는데 뭐 훨씬 딜레이가 훨씬 커지는 약간 리스폰시브니스가 좀 떨어지겠죠. 그래서 아마 이 사람들이 좀 적당하게 그나마 그 리스폰시브니스와 그 다음에 이거를 RFC의 그 이피션시의 밸런스를 좀 나름 맞춘 게 약간 이 정도예요. 아, 그리고 또 한 가지 이슈가 있어요. 또 한 가지 이슈가 있는데 주어진 타임 윈도우 안에서 액티베이션을 할 수 있는 횟수가 제한되어 있어요. 그러니까 액티베이션을 할 때 주어진 타임 윈도우 안에서 액티베이션을 할 수 있는 횟수가 제한이 되어 있어서 예를 들면 지금 리프레시 하려고 그러면 계속 activate, pre-charge, activate, pre-charge, activate, pre-charge 이렇게 해야 되잖아요. 그게 타이밍 그 바이올레이션이 생겨요. 왜냐하면은 그게 왜 그러냐면 파워 문제가 있어요. 왜냐면 액티베이션 하는 게 굉장히 파워를 많이 먹는 오퍼레이션이거든요. 근데 계속 만약에 액티베이션을 다다다다다 이렇게 하면은 이 칩이 파워가 계속 높은 레벨로 유지가 되다 보니까 발열이 생기고 여러 가지 피지컬한 문제가 많이 생겨요. Question? 이런 거를 기말고사 문제로 한번 내볼까? 뭐예요? What's the problem? 뭐 이렇게 디자인 퀘스천으로 해가지고. Okay, so let's move on to row hammering. 시간이 있으면 그것도 하면 좋을 텐데 우리 이번에 스펙터랑 버그 시큐리티 얘기가 나와가지고 스펙터랑 저거 뭐야 멜트다운 이런 것도 하면 좋을 텐데 시간 있을지 모르겠네요. Anyway, so let's move on. Okay, so target row refresh. This is kind of solution to this problem. So I'm going to explain the other parts first and then come back to this because this is in a sense, is a solution to row hammer problem. So I'm going to explain the problem first and then come back to this. So what is the row hammer? Row hammer is a problem, like a security problem of DRAM, modern DRAM. So the idea is that you can basically make the bit flip of arbitrary row in your DRAM without accessing them. Okay, it's kind of weird, right? So let's say if you actually use a computer system, usually the operating system actually provides protection. So if you, let's say you try to access some like a physical memory location which is not allowed for you to use, then actually it actually traps. I mean, it's just it disallows you to from accessing this region, right? But in this case, now you can get right this protection using this like a row hammering technique. And the idea is really, really simple. So here is a problem. So let's say what is the problem with like a disturbance error. So we actually have, as you know, DRAM is like a two-dimensional array structure. There are a bunch of rows, right? The problem is, let's say you're accessing like this thing again and again. You actually open a row, and this word line becomes selected. Now open the row and close it, and open the row again. Close, and you repeat this process again and again. I mean, open, close, the same row again, and again during the very short period of time. Then these like adjacent rows value will be broken. That is called row hammering. 이게 무슨 얘기냐면은 똑같은 로우를 계속 액티베이트 했다가 클로즈 했다, 액티베이트 했다, 클로즈 했다, 계속 똑같은 로우만 계속 반복 이렇게 하면 그 다 옆에 있는 로우들의 값이 망가져요. Becomes one becomes zero. That's called a row hammer. Okay, so this is broadly speaking, this is like a DRAM like a disturbance error. So you repeat continuously like accessing like activating row and pre-charge row, and you do the process for a long time. Then the value in this like adjacent rows, like they are called victim rows, they will be broken. That's like a real like a problem. I mean, just this is called, by the way, this is called hammered row. If you have a hammered row, the adjacent like victim rows, the value will be lost. I mean, they will be broken. It's like probabilistic. I mean, so because there's like some like a capacitive coupling between rows. So even if the rows like they're independent, let's say you have like a row like this. If you remember, DRAM structure looks like this, right? So we have like transistor here. This is bit line, word line, and so on, right? And there's capacitance, like this. This is one row. And there's another row like this. Let's say we have another transistor, capacitor. And there's even though in theory each row is independent, right? But there's actually in actuality there's some like a coupling between these like lines. Capacitive coupling between these lines, and also these like transistors and these like capacitors. There's also like capacitive coupling between these tiny devices, so that if you actually keep like turning on and off, and play with this row, then actually it will eventually break the value in the other like adjacent rows. That's called the row hammering. Okay, so here this victim rows actually gets the if you repeatedly opening and closing a row enough times within a refresh interval, because once you have like a refresh interval passes, then this value gets refreshed, right? Now values become strong again, so it's like less prone to these disturbance errors. But if you during very short period of time, let's say you repeatedly open and close a row enough times, then eventually that breaks the value on the other rows. Okay, so induce disturbance errors in adjacent rows in most real DRAM chips you can buy today. So if there's A company, maybe maybe S, or second one maybe like H company, or maybe third one maybe like M company. The three like major like DRAM vendors. They're like real chips. They actually do some experiments using like real chips, and then 86% of a chip actually had this like row hammering problem. 30%, 88%. It's kind of real like a problem in modern DRAM chips. Okay, so most DRAM modules are vulnerable. So here's a very simple code. How you do that? how you actually implement this like attack. I mean, how you break the value. And then, the worst case could be, let's say the row, like the hammered row is like the yours, like a user level, like a, page you can access. But maybe, adjacent row, maybe some like a privilege, like, some like open systems, like data structure, like a page table or something. Then maybe you can actually, keep accessing your own row, you can actually break the value in the operating system's page table, for example, right? So this is really simple like a tiny attack code. So here, this one is it's actually 6 assembly code. So this one is basically, this one is store instruction. There are 2 store instructions. You actually read the value of EAX register and copy it to the memory location X. And second one is you copy the value of register EBX to memory location Y. And this CL flush means basically you flush the cache. So if you actually ask them, automatically this value will be stored in the cache, right? But if you actually execute the CL flush, this is a cache line flush instruction. So if you execute CL flush, then actually it writes, evict this specific like a line from the cache. In other words, actually it writes back the value to the DRAM. And this mFence is what is called memory fence. Memory fence is basically, it's called like a synchronization primitive. I mean, if you run operating systems, you have synchronization primitive such that all these like a load and store instructions before this fence must be executed first before you move on to the next one. It's called memory fence. So this is a memory fence. So all these like a store instruction will be visible, will be reflected in the system before you move on to the next instruction. That's the mFence. And then finally, this jump loop is like an infinite loop. You go back to the head of the loop and repeat the process again and again. And the constraint here is that we assume that X and Y, they actually are allocated to different like rows in the same bank. That's the assumption. Okay, so that if that condition is hold, then what happens is you keep accessing this X and Y like this. First you access X because you avoid cache hits. Flush X from the cache, and you avoid row hits in X because now because in this way, because we alternating between these 2 rows in the same bank, there's no like a row buffer hits. And there's no cache hit because we actually do like a cache line flush. 그죠? 그러니까 캐시 라인 플러시를 실행하면 지금 캐시에 들어와 있는 X나 Y, EAX, EBX 그 데이터 그 값이 이제 DRAM 쪽으로 이제 쫓겨나겠죠. 쫓겨나는 거고. 그다음에 이거를 2개를 여기다 올려놓은 이유는 왜냐하면은 이거를 이렇게 올려놓지 않으면은 X를 만약에 계속 액세스하면 그 로 버퍼 hit이 나겠죠. 그러니까 실제 액티베이트를 하는 게 아니라 그냥 컬럼 액세스만 계속 할 거 아니에요. 컬럼 액세스 하지 않고 그 액티베이션을 계속 하게 하려고 그러면 얘네 둘 사이에 계속 얘가 쫓아냈다가 얘가 다시 쫓아냈다가 서로 쫓아내야 되겠죠. 그래서 so by alternating between these 2 X and Y, now there's no row buffer hits. So now that means every single like a flush operation actually leads to a deactivation command for X and Y. Okay, so now in this way, if you repeat this process if you run this code, by the way, the code is available in GitHub. Although most of these things are basically already patched in the software, so probably it's very difficult to see now, but the example code is in GitHub. If you're interested, you may want to try it. Although, as I said, they already had patched this like bug, so it may be much more difficult today to see it. So let's say now how it works. First you actually do the store to row X, and now in the next instruction, now you actually store to row Y. And you repeat this process again and again, go back and forth between the 2. Then eventually you break the value in the adjacent like a victim rows around X and Y. And then they actually measured the failure rates. So in Intel Haswell, Intel Ivy Bridge, Sandy Bridge, Pile Driver, all these like a major like a CPU architecture. Like in 2014, the errors were actually much higher for Intel, interestingly, than AMD. Why is this so? Can you guess why? 집적도 차이. 어차피 근데 DRAM 칩은 같은 칩이니까 DRAM 예를 들면 같은 파트를 쓴다고 하면은 DRAM의 집적도 차이는 아니겠죠. 이걸 보면 알 수 있겠죠, 이거. Because AMD's performance was so sucked. I mean, at the time. 그러니까 이게 되게 그 당시에는 느린 게 좋은 것도 있는 거예요. 왜냐면은 이거를 리프레시 인터벌 안에 이걸 최대한 막 이걸 해야 되는데 AMD 시스템이 너무 구려가지고 이게 그 짧은 인터벌 안에 충분한 메모리 리퀘스트를 못 만들어내는 거예요. 그죠? 그래서 sometimes slow is better in security perspective. I mean, because their like access rate is much like a 2x lower than this Intel CPU. And Intel CPU actually very highly optimized. They actually keep generating all this like activation command to the DRAM, but its AMD processor actually generates much slower pace. The accessing the DRAM rows. So and then refresh period elapsed, and it just row hammer doesn't work. Right? 그래서 사실은 제일 그냥 간단한 방법은 CPU를 프리퀀시 낮추는 방법이에요. CPU 프리퀀시를 낮추면 왜냐면 퍼포먼스가 안 나와서 이게 짧은 기간 동안에 이거를 충분히 이거를 디스터브를 못해서 그 디스터브 되기 전에 리프레시가 막 일어나는 거예요. 리프레시가 일어나면서 이제 다시 값이 이제 빅팀 로우의 값이 다시 리커버 되는 거죠. 그러면 이제 다시 이제 값이 안 깨지고. 그래서 느린 게 좋은 점도 있다. 그런 거죠. So it's real reliability and security issue. And after this problem is announced, Google guys they kind of come up with a technique to overtake this like kernel privilege, using this technique. So this is the first one. This paper is about the problem. The row hammer is a problem with some like recent DRAM devices in which you can actually flip the bits without accessing them. And they actually found multiple like DRAM vendors actually went through the same problem of this row hammer, and later this like this Google guys they actually come up with a technique to using like a row hammer bug to gain like OS kernel privilege. So it can be like a serious like a performance bug, serious like a security problem. So one exploit used like a row hammer induced bit flips to gain like kernel privilege on x86 64 Linux when run as unprivileged user-run process. Basically, you run like your own like a version of this like a simple attack code. Eventually, get the privilege of the OS like kernel like access, kernel level privilege. Also, you can actually using this row hammer bug, you can actually change the value of PTE, page table entry, so that now you actually corrupt the mapping between virtual memory and physical memory to take over the entire physical memory space. I haven't read this paper, so if you're interested, to take a look at. Although, as I said, it's patched. They're patched, so it's not as serious today. But this one is original, like a bit flip, like this like a row hammer paper. Okay. By the way, this guy is Kim. I know this guy. He and then this Google they actually announced security exploits based on that. So how we can solve the problem? How we can solve this like a row hammer problems? Of course, you can actually make better DRAM chips or refresh more frequently. So if you actually refresh more frequently, they actually reduce the window of vulnerability, right? Because now you refresh a lot faster. I mean, a lot frequently. Then now it's much harder to flip the bits. And more sophisticated ECC error correction code. Maybe you can do some like a parity, more sophisticated ECC code to detect like error. Or access counters. Access counter is something that you actually throttle the access. Basically, you only allow certain number of times one row can be accessed. I mean, that kind of like access control. I mean, access throttling can actually help mitigating the problem. All of these things actually comes with a cost. Make better DRAM chips. It makes your DRAM chip more expensive. And more refresh like power and performance cost, and also sophisticated ECC, more DRAM area plus like power and all these things. There's some overhead comes with it. So naive solutions, you actually throttle the access to the same row, because if you want to mount this row hammer attack, you actually have to access the same row again and again. So there are two ways to throttle. The first one is like an access interval. Let's say limit the access interval. You can access the same row only, at certain time interval. Okay, so there's a limit like access interval, and second one is like a limit like number of accesses. That's basically how you limit the access to the same row again and again. Or second technique is like a refresh more frequently. So shorten refresh interval by some number of times, then basically you have much stronger protection than before. So this like they are kind of naive solutions because they come with a cost as I showed you in the previous slide. Both naive solutions into significant overhead in performance and power. So this is like a row hammer patch from like Apple. If you use iPhone, actually MacBook by the way, this is like a OS X 10, like Mountain Lion. They actually have like some like a patch. The solution is really simple. If you see here, the solution is increasing the memory refresh rate by software. Okay, so you can actually control this like a register, some like a BIOS like a register to actually control this like a refresh rate, and their solution is simply just increasing the memory refresh rate to prevent this problem. And HP and Lenovo released the similar patches increasing the memory refresh rates. And maybe some better technique could be some like a probabilistic adjacent row activation. It sounds very complex, but idea is really simple. I mean, so instead of like to prevent this like a row hammer attack, the key idea is after closing a row, let's say this row is a like hammered row. I mean, this is like you're leveraging. After closing a row, we activate like one of its neighbor rows with certain probability. 그러니까 어떤 로우를 X할 때마다 확률적으로 그냥 랜덤 코인을 던져가지고 몇 퍼센트의 확률로 이 둘 중에 하나를 옆에 있는 어드지센트한 로우를 리프레시 하는 거죠. 그죠? 근데 보통은 이제 한 번 하면은 그 확률이 되게 낮겠지만 보통 우리가 로우 해머링을 할 때는 같은 로우를 계속 반복하니까 이러다가 언젠가 한 번은 이게 뒤집어지겠죠. 한 번은 이게 또 리프레시가 또 추가로 되겠죠. 그러니까 어떻게 보면은 그냥 대개의 경우는 그냥 한 번씩 X 되는 경우에는 아마도 리프레시가 안 되는데 똑같은 로우를 만약에 계속 리프레시를 하게 되면은 똑같은 로우를 만약에 계속 액티베이트를 하게 되면은 그때는 아마 상당히 높은 확률로 둘 중에 하나는 적어도 리프레시가 되게 하는 거죠. So this we activate refresh one with neighbor with a row probability. So reliability guarantees when p equals 0.005, then errors happening the probability of errors happening in 1 year is like 9.4 times 10 to the power minus 14, which is really low. So it's kind of even though you actually have very low like p, the chance for error becomes significantly low. Also, by adjusting the value of p, we can provide arbitrarily strong protection against error. Let's say what happens if p is 1? p가 1이면 어떻게 돼요? 확률이 1이면. 그럼 매번 액티베이션, 그러니까 클로즈 할 때마다 둘 중에 하나는 리프레시 해주는 거죠. 옆에 있는 것 중에 하나는. 그죠? 굉장히 어떻게 보면 성능이 굉장히 안 좋겠죠. 그러면 굉장히 오버헤드가 크겠죠. 그렇지만 프로텍션은 좋을 거고. 왜냐면 리프레시 자주 해주면 자주 해줄수록 이게 값이 안 깨지니까. 그죠? So there's nice knob you can control to trade off reliability versus or security and reliability versus power and energy. All right, I think the last part of today's lecture is about new memory. So as I said, there's a serious problem with like DRAM scaling. I mean, it's very difficult to scale down the DRAM device itself. Refresh power is becoming larger if you actually have a larger chip. So how can solve the problem? Maybe one direction is more is like an evolutionary path to improving this DRAM device, but the other path could be more like a revolutionary path of like having like a new memory, not DRAM, not flash, or something, like a new memory. So here's a problem, refresh overhead. This one actually shows the throughput loss, the percentage of time as we increase the capacity of a DRAM device. So in like a 2 gigabit device, we only pay like a 2 point something percent, time as a like refresh cost. In 4 gigabyte, it increased by a factor of 2, but now we actually have like a 64 in the future DRAM. By the way, we are somewhere between here, and here. We are here currently. But in the future, maybe we have like a 64, gigabyte like a device. Then almost like 50% of time is lost for refresh. It's blocked. Because we have so many rows to refresh, and the time interval doesn't change, right? So this is a serious problem. And also power-wise, we also have a similar problem. The refresh power becomes really, really big. So now this one becomes almost like take almost half of the entire DRAM's power. So DRAM refresh is expected to give significant performance power overhead in the future. So one solution could be we make a better DRAM chips, and another solution is kind of we come up with a new type of DRAM, new kind of chip memory device. So here, before doing that, we actually look at this is very hard to this is like a modern like a DRAM chip architecture. If you see this is DRAM like a silicon DRAM die, and if you open it, this one actually what it looks like. This is like a transistor. This is a 1-bit like a cell. I mean, this is by the way, this is the capacitor. This is like a big like a cone. The vertical cone is actually that's the capacitor. This capacitor, and this one is basically access transistor for like used for controlled by word line. So if you look at we take apart only one transistor, then it look like this. So this one is the transistor. Transistor looks like this. This is gate, and this is the silicon based substrate, and this one is storage node, or this one is basically capacitor. This capacitor is actually is here. It's actually like a 3-dimensional structure. I mean, it's vertically very like high structure. So this one you actually stored 1 bit of information here, and this is a bit line, by the way. And the aspect ratio is today. It's not today. It's 4 years ago. Aspect ratio is about like a 25. Means that the aspect ratio is the ratio between this like lengths of the bottom to the height. The aspect ratio is 25, meaning that if you have like a 1 millimeter like in length in the bottom, then the height is like a 25 millimeter. So it's really like very tiny and skinny like a structure like this, right? But if you compare, Burj Khalifa, I mean, I think this one is in Dubai. If you compare these two like a structure, this aspect ratio is only 6, but it's much, compared to that, this is much like a thinner and longer, taller like a structure compared to this one. And if you actually have very tall structure, it's more and more difficult to build, because it's very easy to, if you have a very like thin, like a large structure, they can actually put together, or some like there can be shortage can happen or something like that. So this one shows an example. Let's say, this one is technology node, and the aspect ratio goes like a skyrockets. I mean, this goes up a lot, and that makes this chip much more difficult to build. So if you see here, this one actually shows a problem. So if you see here, this is the two capacitor, and they were actually stuck. I mean, they just they were basically there's like a shortage between the two like capacitor. So this one is very hard to make it hard at a high density. So this one is kind of electrical microscopy like a photo, what this DRAM chip looks like, and it's very difficult to make them without any problem. So maybe new memory includes like something, I don't know how many of you actually have heard about this like crosspoint or MRAM or PRAM or PCM and so on. But there are like many like alternatives being considered to replace DRAM and flash. So one of the examples is Intel's 3D crosspoint, which is somewhere between DRAM and flash. So if you compare DRAM and flash, like SSD or USB, right? So DRAM is actually more expensive, and this flash is cheap, but DRAM is actually much faster than flash. So DRAM access time is much shorter than SSD, like this access time, right? So there's a trade-off between DRAM and flash, and this cross point is exactly in the middle. This is like cross point, 3D cross point. Is like in terms of the density, in terms of the cost, it's somewhere in the middle. It's cheaper than DRAM, but more expensive than flash. And the speed-wise is about in the middle. I mean, it's much faster than flash, much slower than DRAM. Okay, So it's somewhere in between. So that's this like a 3D cross-point device. And they Intel actually released very little about the internals of this cross-point, but people guess it's kind of PCM, like a phase change memory. So in the phase change memory, the 1 bit of information is stored using the phase of a material. So let's say you have like a material called GST. It's some chemical, long like chemical name. So GST actually have two stable states. The first one is amorphous. It's more like liquid. Amorphous state, then it's like a very, the structure is very irregular, and it has very high like R, like resistivity. In contrast, if you have a crystalline state, then it actually has a very low resistivity. So we actually encode like 1 bit of information using the resistivity. If it has like a high R, like a resistivity, then it's like a 0. If it's like low resistivity, then it's 1. Okay. So that's how we can actually encode a value. So by the way, from amorphous to high resistivity to low resistivity is called set operation. It's like a 0 to 1. And reset is the opposite, like a 1 to 0. And then as I said, the 1 bit of information is encoded using the register value, the resistivity of the material. So it's a high resistivity is 0, and low resistivity is 1. Okay, and it's a programming operating principle. I think it's kind of too much details, but operating principle. If you want to set the value from 1 to 0, let's say reset the value from 1 to 0, then you actually put apply very high, this like a tall current pulse. Then what happens is the temperature of the device actually goes up. So then now it becomes more of this amorphous state. It's like a liquid, right? Because it has very high, temperature. So if you actually, if you apply, very high, current, then now it becomes it melts. Actually, melts down to now it becomes like some like a liquid-like state, like amorphous state, to reset the value to 0. And if you do if you actually apply more of this much like lower current for a longer time, then now this like material now is put into the like a crystalline state. So now it becomes like 1. So from 0 to 1, right? So and PCM actually has asymmetries. It actually has for reset you actually apply very high current for a very period of time. For set like a state, you actually apply like low current for a long period of time, and read actually takes a lot like a shorter pulse. So write is much slower. So write latency is much slower than read latency, because read only takes like this like a small like a pulse of like a current, but write actually takes much longer, because you need to actually heat up this like device. So it takes longer to overwrite the value in this device. But read is much faster. And read power is likewise, read power is much less than write power, and read endurance is much greater than write endurance. So endurance means that how many times you can write the value to the device. If you use like a flash device, 여러분 USB 같은 거 쓰면 오래 쓰면은 다 못 쓰잖아요. 그죠? 요즘은 USB 어느 정도 쓰냐면 한 1000번대, 수천 번. USB 이거 write USB 이런 거 쓰면은 수천 번 정도 쓰면 이제 못 쓰죠. 근데 이제 얘도 이제 많이 쓰면 쓸수록 이제 디바이스가 닳는다고 그랬나? 디바이스가 닳아가지고 인듀런스 프로블럼이 있는데 이제 write를 많이 하면은 금방 닳고요. read를 많이 하는 건 좀 낫고 그런 장단점이 있죠. So the PCM device actually has many like asymmetries: latency asymmetry, energy asymmetry, and endurance asymmetry. Generally, read is much faster, and read is much nicer than writes in general. And crosspoint is about the same. I mean, it's the same device. They largely regard it as a kind of variant of PCM device. So Intel, they try to take over this like a market share from Samsung, by introducing this device. So they try to place this like a 3D crosspoint in between this flash and DRAM. So hopefully, they can take some market share from these DRAM and flash vendors. they actually also put this like a 3D cross-point DIMM into their server design. So they actually replace this like a DRAM device, and also they also have like a SSD form factor. So they actually also sell like SSD using this cross-point. Generally, it's much faster than SSD, much lower latency, but the capacity-wise, it's actually much worse. I mean, it's more expensive, so you cannot really afford the same capacity. 좋은 말로 하면 플래시보다 빠르고 디램보다 싼 거고, 나쁜 말로 하면은 디램보다 느리고 플래시보다 비싼 거죠. 되게 애매한 디바이스죠. 근데 이제 아주 본질적인 질문은 이런 거겠죠. 우리가 지금 이제 스탠다드가 뭐냐면 이제 메모리는 디램, 디스크는 플래시, 그죠? 이게 SSD 쓰고 있잖아요. 하나의 레벨이 더 필요하냐? 메모리 하이어라키에, 그죠? 메모리 하이어라키의 그 중간쯤 되는 디바이스가 포지션이 있냐? 약간 이건 좀 비즈니스적인 질문일 수도 있고, 뭐 테크니컬한 질문일 수도 있고, 뭐 어플리케이션이 만약 그걸 잘 쓸 수 있으면 필요할 수도 있고, 어플리케이션이 별로 못 쓰면은 필요 없을 수도 있고. 현재로서는 조금 애매한 포지션이라는 입장이에요. 디램이나 플래시를 직접 리플레이스 하기는 조금 어려울 것 같고, 그 중간에 뭔가 새로운 레이어를 하나 더 집어넣겠다는 건데, 그게 모르겠네요. 킬러 앱이 있으면 모르겠지만 현재는 좀 애매한 것 같아요. Alright, that's it. So we conclude this like memory system lecture. So we're gonna move on to like a neural net.